I'm now recording, so I'm back up here and we'll share my screen. There we go. Okay, so can everybody see?
I lost it now.
We okay?
Hold on.
Yeah.
Now she. Okay, go ahead.
So hopefully everybody can see that and hear me. So this is Ways We Think About Money. Laura, I wasn't sure if you wanted to start anything or I can just start right up.
Go right ahead, Tom. Start away.
Terrific. Okay. Thank you all for being here. I will say, and I was mentioning before we started, for any of you who are visually impaired, there are some visuals. We do try to take them out, but there are some visuals that are part of the presentation. So just know that Craig and I, as we go through this, if there are any pictures on the screen, we will try to describe them as best we can. The agenda that we have for you today, we're going to do just a quick introduction to who we are, so you know a little bit about Craig and myself. We'll talk about how we think about money, credit and debt, and what that all means for us, budgeting, which is really the heart of this. And because it's that time of the year, 11 ways to help you be in better financial shape for 2021. So that's what we're going to do. And then there is a chat box, which has already been utilized. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to go ahead, use the chat box, because Craig, my co-pilot, who I'll introduce in a second, will keep us and he'll follow up on that. And there will be time at the end for Q&A as well. All right, so there's a lot of words on the screen and I'm not going to read them because they're about us and we're really not that important. So just know the Moody Street Group is a financial services firm in Newton. The only thing that really is impactful on that screen is that we dedicate a portion of the firm to what we call the Special Needs Resource Network. The mission of the Special Needs Resource Network is to work with a family that has a child who's differently abled or has a disability. The goal of the Special Needs Resource is to connect with as many organizations, advocates, and other professionals that we can so we can be that resource. About us, our presenters. Okay, so there's cartoon pictures on the screen, little caricatures of myself and Craig. I am Tom Alessi. I have been in financial services for more than 21 years now. I am an investment advisor. That means that I act as a fiduciary when I am giving advice or guidance to any of my clients. Craig, you want to bring yourself in?
Sure. So I'm Craig Richardson. I'm the Vice President of the Ares Foundation. I've been in the financial services business for a little over 16 years now. And I specialize in working with families and small businesses to help them put together a plan so they can have a better relationship with their money.
Thank you, sir. And like I said, Craig will be chiming in as we go along with this, but also if there are any questions in the chat box, he'll sort of act as my Vanna White and be jumping in with following up on those questions or concerns. So I told you the Special Needs Resource Network. So on the screen, there's a couple of visuals. One of the things that we do with the Special Needs Resource Network is we do a monthly newsletter. It's what we call Connections Update. And really what it is community outreach, trying to help spread the word for any organizations, whether you have events coming up that are conferences, fundraisers, trainings, whatever it may be. And the reason I mentioned it is because we've had Perkins in the newsletter just about every month. You guys always have something going on. But in the middle of it, we spotlight every month a different either organization or some person or something that's going on. About a year ago at this time, the spotlight of the month was Career Launch. And specifically, the picture is of that graduating class from Career Launch from that year, the 19 into 20, because Craig and I happened to do a presentation, our finance and money management for those. We do one that's for the younger aged adults, but also for individuals who are in adult day programs. And we happen to do it for that particular graduating class. And then there's another picture that shows you that Spotlight of the Month thing. Perkins actually sponsored the sponsorship of Spotlight of the Month for one of our newsletters. So, we've done a lot with Perkins as far as going through that. The other thing that we have, and I'm just going to be quick with this, is Craig and I launched a nonprofit. It's called the Aries Foundation for Financial Education. It is about exactly what we're doing today, which is financial literacy. It just allows us to get a bigger footprint in the financial education, financial literacy world. And we do everything through the nonprofit. You can visit it. It's ariesfoundation.org. Learn a little bit more about that and what we do. But one of the things we've done with that has been ongoing webinars on different topics. And we did have one that involved career launch in the Perkins School, which was on inclusion and diversity in the workplace. And we had Dina and Alicia on board with us talking about different ways for employers that they could be more proactive or get better at having a more diverse and inclusive work site. And during that presentation, completely unprompted, but Dina was very kind. And what it says is, we were just talking about the presentation we did for career launch, and it is an incredible presentation. I have to say, the students have an incredibly good time. They're laughing the whole time, and they're learning a lot. I highly recommend bringing these two in. It sounds much better when she says it, but for us, it's very humbling, and we certainly appreciate the feedback that we get when we're dealing with that and doing some of these presentations. All right, that's on us. Enough with that. So now we're going to move into what we're talking about today, which is really different ways we feel and deal with money, right? Because money, when you come right down to it, has nothing to do with money. Money is numbers, it's facts, it's figures, and that's not really what we're dealing with here. That when we try to treat money like math. Craig, I'm going to bring you in for this because you do this with everybody when you talk about that money isn't math.
Correct. Yeah. So what we find with working with people and is that it's really the emotional impact that money has at them that creates their behaviors. So really, when you're trying to get rid of the stigma of how you deal with money, the first thing you have to do is address the fact that money isn't math. It's really emotion. It's really about what's driving you when it comes to making financial decisions. So that's something you really have to understand in order to get engaged in the process. Like a lot of times we'll work with a couple, and one of the couple may actually handle the finances. They say, well, I don't need the other partner involved in the decision because they really don't understand finance anyway. Well, they understand emotion, and that's what really drives most of the financial planning that we do. It's about value, about emotion, about what's important to you to help you achieve the things and have that better relationship with your money that we're trying to get you on the path for.
Right, absolutely. And that's the idea behind it, is that everybody's got emotional baggage when it comes to dealing with money. And it's really trying to understand how to get around that or how to be better at it to sort of, break away from it. And, one of the things we talk about, and this will come up in a little bit, but we talk about this with setting up and looking at short, mid, and long-term goals. Right. It's a great time of the year to be doing that. We just turned the new year, this whole thing about goal setting and resolutions and all of that, and how to be better with what you're trying to do. But if you just take the step and say, this is what I put in place for my resolution for 2021 was to do X with my money, or to be better at this, or maybe it's I want to save for something, or pay down debt, or get rid of a credit card, whatever the case may be. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit about the reality of what happens when we do that. But for the point of goal setting, we want to make sure that we're writing them down and we're being cognizant of them. And we'll talk later on when we get to accountability and some parts of that, right? But as we go into that whole thing about wants, and the visual on the screen, for the younger audience here, Veruca Salt from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I suggest if you haven't seen the original Willy Wonka that you look it up and see the original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. But this is Veruca Salt, where in the movie she sings the song "Give It to Me Now," which is basically she wants a golden goose and she'll do anything to get the golden goose right at that moment in time. Our thing is with the "Give It to Me Now" is you've got to be thinking about and realizing that if I spend the dollar today, that dollar is not available tomorrow. I can't pay for something now and expect to be able to use that same money later down the line. And so what we try to say with this, and we just did this whole thing on trying to be a better spender or saver, is that we know you get caught up in it. Like, I want this thing, I got to have it, give it to me now. But what we suggest doing is taking a step back. Maybe it's what we call a cooling down period, right? So I really want to buy this thing, but I'm going to take 24 hours and just take a step back and let myself cool down a little or cool off, and then come back to it and revisit it. And if I still want it and I still want to buy it, I'm going to buy it then. But this way we're not getting caught up in the I got to have it now thing. Because again, if I spend the money now, I'm not going to have it later on.
Talk about impulse buying, correct?
Correct. Or as Veruca would say, give it to me right now. But that leads us into the next part. And on the screen it's a cartoon couple. And she says, explain to me again why enjoying life when I retire is more important than enjoying life now. And we understand that's what it feels like sometimes, that it can feel very restrictive or constrictive when we're talking about, saving money for later on in life. But wait, I can't spend it now. Why do I want to have, I'm supposed to be enjoying myself when I'm 70 versus enjoying myself when I'm 30. It's not the case, though that's sometimes what it feels like. We're not saying don't spend now, but what we're trying to say is be more efficient at it, think about it, and understand, and that's what the tagline at the top says, is that every decision you make is ultimately a retirement decision, because every dollar that you're spending now is not available for you later on in life. We understand the balance, right? That's what you got to find, the right mix, the right balance. I'm spending now, I'm enjoying myself, but I'm not taking away or costing myself later on in life, because that's ultimately going to be the longest vacation you're ever going to take. And so you need to be thinking in terms of when you're spending, and that's why we say we talk about that cooling down period, right? That you want to make sure I'm spending efficiently and in a way that makes sense, not only for now, but the future now. All right, so I mentioned about that we talked about financial priorities versus reality. And I talked to you about, hey, if you were writing stuff down, if you were putting down what your goal was for this year, or if you had a resolution about spending and what you were doing with that. Well, the reality is that, say it's saving for something, or you're trying to save for a vacation, or save for a new car, or even pay down some debt. Great that you're putting it down as a goal or a resolution, but the reality that happens is that ultimately we end up putting, it's usually the number is about 3% towards that goal. Even though we're saying it's our number one concern right now, this is the one thing I want to save for, this is the one thing I want to do with my money. The reality is we don't end up putting savings towards that goal. We end up doing what we normally do, and we'll talk about this a little later when we get into budgeting and other parts of it. But what ends up happening there is we end up getting very frustrated, and we get stressed about the fact that we're not meeting or attaining or achieving this goal that we're trying to achieve.
The other thing too, Tom, is no one should feel bad about this. If you look at the national average when it comes to savings, it's actually a negative number. I mean, people are not good at saving. And one of those things is social pressure. They don't teach you how to save, they teach you how to spend.
Right.
That's why.
Yeah, and that's a part of it, right? And we'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of ways to think about that and trying to get better. And that's part of the budgeting thing. And it also comes right into, so the next visual on the screen is a train that's pulling into the saving station. So you got to, forgive me with this, but that's my analogy for it when I talk about savings. That what happens is we tell ourselves, and whether it's the retirement plan or some great, something that's further down the line, a bigger goal that we're saving for, the analogy is that I'm going to do it once I pay off or finish X. And usually that's, hey, I'm somebody who's just out of school. I've got some college debt. So when I pay off the college debt, then I'll start participating in the retirement plan. Then what happens? Well, then I get married. Well, now I got to save for that. Or we want to buy a house, or we're having a baby. So I got to save for that. Now there's education for the funding for the kid. And we keep saying that it's the next thing that's going to happen. Then I'll start saving for that goal, and especially if it's retirement that we're talking about.
Hey, mind the gap. Isn't that a London thing?
That's the next visual. I haven't gotten there yet. I'm still in the savings train. Leave my stations alone. So the second one there. So that's the savings train that it never pulls into the station. The idea with that is that if you do have access to the retirement plan, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well, that the idea is that fundamentally you should participate. Even if you're just participating at 1 or 2%, the one thing you're never going to be able to get back is time. So it's not like, hey, I wanted to put 5 or 10% away into the plan. It's getting in is more important, and starting and beginning than waiting. The mind the gap. So that's the other visual there. It says mind the gap. That's if you've ever ridden the tube in London. Every time a train pulls into a station, before the doors open, they tell you to mind the gap because there's a distance between the doors and the platforms in London. So it's mind the gap. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is in retirement, Social Security is only going to pay you X percentage of what the income that you need. You need Y, right? You need a higher number than that. That gap is your responsibility. You're responsible. You've got to mind that gap. And so that's part of this for your own sake and for retirement purposes, about looking at least if you're not in, doing some kind of a contribution into the plan. And that leads us into what's in your buckets. So the visual is these are buckets, and I apologize for buckets, but that's what I use for my visualization with this. Some people prefer bags, some people like pools. My thing is buckets. It's buckets of money. And what you need to visualize with that is that your money should be broken down into 3 separate buckets. That first bucket should be your short-term emergency reserves. Traditionally, advisors have always said that you should have 3, 6, or 9 months of expenses in that bucket. Craig and I are telling everybody right now it's 6 weeks, right? You should have at least 6 weeks of expenses in that bucket. If last year didn't tell you anything, that any time now we could go into another setback, quarantine, shutdown, whatever you want to call it. So the first thing you should do is get 6 weeks into that initial bucket, into your savings, into the bank. If you don't have it right now, that should be the first place you go. And then you have buckets 2 and 3. The second one is more of that midterm. I'm saving for something, whether that's an upgrade in my transportation, upgrade in my housing, maybe it's a vacation, that type of thing. And the third bucket is my longer term planning. That's education funding for a kid if it's a younger child. That's retirement planning, that type of thing. And so the visual to use is that I'm filling bucket number 1 up first. Once bucket number 1 is filled, now I can start filling buckets 2 and 3. But buckets 2 and 3 are not, I'm going to fill 2 and then go to 3. It's more of I'm filling a little bit into 2 and a little bit into 3. But I got to get 1 filled first. Because if I don't fill bucket number 1, that's when we get into debt. We'll start talking about what happens there. And when we need funding for something, we don't have a bucket to dip into. So we use those terrible things that are plastic that we'll talk about with credit cards. Craig, you got anything on that?
No, I think we're going to cover it in the next couple slides, what I have to say.
Okay, there we go. So it's just talking, and again, we're stressing, and the reason the emergency reserves comes up again is because we do really want to stress. We think this is very, very important for everybody. So, and when we'll get to it when we get to budgeting about, taking care of yourself, but you really need to be having this bucket get filled. So if you don't have an emergency reserve fund, by that I mean maybe a separate account. And when we talk about those three buckets, it's a visual, but maybe for some people it becomes easier if I've got three separate accounts that I am funding into so that I'm aware of that. Now, you may, if you're participating in the retirement plan at Perkins, that's one of the buckets. That can be bucket number 3. But then you got to have a bucket that's 1 and 2, and 1 honestly should be separate. It should not be easily obtained. There shouldn't be a debit card that's attached to 1, because 1 should only be there for when the emergencies come up, when I absolutely have to dip into a bucket, or the possibility of another shutdown or quarantine occurs, and now I don't have income coming in. I've got to pay my expenses.
It's some kind of separating action, so you realize it's important enough to take that action to access the money.
Correct. That there's some bridge or hurdle or whatever, again, visual you want to use, that you got to get to that. I did it with my older daughter. She just graduated from college. She's got some student loan that's got to be taken care of. So in her case, we set up a separate account. That's her bucket that she's going to be using for that. It is separate and it is not attached to anything else. She can't write a check off it. She can't get it through a debit card. So that money is intended to just pay back student loan. That's what it's for. And so it's a separate bucket that does that same idea, because that's what she's trying to save for. All right. So credit versus debt, right? So, when we talk about this, the realities of credit, when you come right down to it, you use credit because you don't have the money to pay for something. And in some cases, the reality is I've got, it's an emergency, I've got to do it. But really what happens for most of us is we go all the way back to Veruca there with give it to me now, and I want it now, and I don't care that I don't have the total funds to pay for it. I got to have it. Here's my credit card, give it to me. And that's where we get into trouble, right? You can see on the screen, it says there's no good reason to have more than one credit card. If you can consolidate your cards into one card, if you've got more than one credit card, we suggest you do that. Use the one that's the longest standing, because you'll have the most credit usually with that card. But, one of the things that you really don't want to have, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, is those store credit cards, because that's a way that we end up spending more than we necessarily needed or wanted to in going through it. The other part on there, it says, not having that emergency reserves that I could pay for some medical care, ends up causing some of that. But if you think of, just like we talked about, if I spend this money and I'm paying on a credit card for it, that's taking away from other parts of my life that I might be able to use that money for. So it's not really giving me anything. It's taking away from me in the long term. So you got to be thinking about that and be smarter about how we're spending our money with a credit card.
Actually, medical bills, Tom, are one of the biggest reasons for people filing bankruptcy.
Right. Yeah, that does add up right on top of that. But, it's really the mindset, and that's that cooling down period that we talked about, to say, gee, you know what? I really don't need this today. If I wait a month, I can build up more cash, and then I'm able to pay for it where I don't have to have as much on credit and go through that.
So keep that appendix an extra month.
Yeah. You didn't really need it. All right. So, we talk about the credit scores and getting your credit report. So you can get a credit report. You should get a credit report once a year. and this is nothing more, one, so that you know what your number is. And we'll talk in a second about, what that really means and the credit score. But the other is it'll tell you everything that's on there. So if there are any, things that might, you don't recognize, or some sort of a tab that's on there, or maybe a bill that you had squared away that was but it's still showing up on your credit score. So it's a good idea just to go back and once a year, just check your credit score just to make sure that everything is okay and that it's on there that should be. And then if there are any disputes, you can dispute it and make sure it gets cleaned up. But how to have a better credit score, like we just talked about. One card, right? One card better than having multiple cards, because you're going to stay more on tap and on track with that one card. Your credit utilization ratio, this is just the number, but that says how much I have access to and how much I'm actually using. And if you just think of this in terms of percentages, if the number is under a third, you're in a good place. By that, I mean, if you're using less than 1/3 of the available credit that's on a revolving basis, you're okay. It's when you get past the 50% marker, that's where your credit score really starts to get damaged. So you want to make sure you're looking at your credit score, looking at what's on there, and then start to see, gee, maybe I need to start paying some of this debt down so I can bring my credit score up. Pay your bills on time. That's the very, very simple way to build up your credit score. Just pay the bills. We talk about that with the store cards, right? So store cards, and I can probably name somebody in the audience has got, a Target card or a Kohl's card, or, a Home Depot card, or one of those that's out there. And while I understand its convenience, and sometimes, hey, they're giving you a good deal on something, it also, we go into a store to buy 3 items, and we just did this thing on this where we were talking about in terms of how to be better at saving. Whereas, I walked in, and next thing you know, I went in there for 3 items, but I came out with 8. And I just spent because I did it. The other thing is try to do it without the cart, because those carts now have become like mini SUVs in terms of the more stuff I can pile into a cart than what I actually need when I'm going through that.
The other thing, Tom, too, is like I actually had a client, and she had, let's say, a Kohl's card, and she got it because I get a discount if I buy at Kohl's and I use the card. Well, that's great. I said, but you're carrying a balance, and maybe you got a discount of 10%, but you're paying 18% on the card interest. Right. So you're giving up the very discount that you wanted, and you're giving it back.
Yeah, and that's part of it is, a lot of times you get the cards with the offer that's, oh yeah, no, it's 0%, for the next 6 months or 12 months or whatever the case may be, but that's only if you pay everything off. If you haven't paid it off by the end of that time period, they get to retro back and kick the rate up. And as Craig said, usually into the, 20% type of range. And then the last one on there is, your goal is eventually not to care about your credit score, because you'll be in a place where you'll be so comfortable and have no problems that you don't have to worry about it. That's the idea behind why you have the credit score, but you get yourself into such a place where it's like, well, okay, I don't care because I've got enough, and I know that if I need to purchase something, I can. All right, this visual is Lassie. This is the collie dog for everybody probably has never seen Lassie, the TV show. But the premise behind Lassie, the TV show, is that what would happen is her owner is this boy, is little Timmy. And so little Timmy would go out into the woods and go skipping in the fields. And then Timmy would fall into a well. And eventually Lassie would come and realize Timmy's in the well. And then he'd run into town and get people to come out and save him. And then little Timmy would be rescued. Only to have the next episode where little Timmy would be back out in the woods, skipping in the fields, and little Timmy would fall into a well again. And then Lassie would have to come and save him. And this whole idea is exactly what happens with people in debt. We do the same thing. We fall into the same well over and over and over again. And what it really is trying to say that you need to really understand and look at how you're spending and what's happening with that spending, to get yourself out of that cycle of constantly falling into the well of debt, or as like Craig says, get yourself off the hamster wheel of debt. Craig, you got anything you wanted to add to that?
No, no, I was, so you're right. It's really about that, the big thing that draws people in is, I want to get out of debt, and we'll go through the whole procedure that, show them how to pay it down, and then they finally get themselves out. And a lot of people do, they dig themselves out, do a great job, and then all of a sudden they're right back into it again. And a lot of that is because,
No, and I was just going to say, and that's usually going back to what we talked about, which was the fact that there isn't that emergency reserve, right? Or
correct, it's the issue. Yep.
and we're going to talk about, if you are in debt and if you do have debt, how to pay that off, right? Some of the different strategies and what we consider the ways that work in terms of if you've got debt right now, we're going to walk you through methods and the best way to get out of debt, or at least to pay it off. So there's really three different models, right? One of them that's okay, one of them that doesn't work, and one that we have ascribed to as being the best way to go. So the first one, it says math. And math is okay to use in this situation because this is math. Math just says, I'm going to take the highest interest credit or rate that I am paying, and that's the one I'm going to focus on first. And then once that's done, I'm going to focus on the next one, and so on and so on. That's the math theory. I'm just paying the highest interest off first. It works, it's okay, but it doesn't necessarily really help us stay motivated. And we'll talk about that in a second. The last one in the list is the shotgun method, which is I'm just throwing different money and different totals at all my debts, trying to get them all down at the same time. And frankly, that method does not work. It ends up creating frustration. We don't feel like we build any momentum. We feel like we just keep into the same process, same thing over and over again, and really doesn't help us achieve the goal that we're trying to achieve. The one in the middle says momentum. And momentum works like this. I've got 4 debts, A, B, C, D. And I'm going to look at it and find the one with the lowest balance first. Let's call that C. So I'm going to focus, I'm only going to pay the minimum monthly on A, B, and D, and all the money I was going to spend across the board, I'm going to focus and get rid of C. Once I'm rid with C, I then take all the money I was spending on C and then focus it on the next lowest balance. Let's call that A. That would be the next card I pay off. Again, same thing. B and D get minimum amounts until I've paid that off and focus it. It does 2 things. One, by focusing on the smallest amount, the one that's most achievable, we get the motivation, the reward. I paid it off. I did something and it's an accomplishment, and the brain triggers this is a thing I can do. And it helps when we're talking about paying down debt, because debt can feel like this massive boulder that's sitting behind us that's going to run us down. And if we can chip away at it and get some of it off the table, it's a wonderful feeling. So long as we do 2 things, we continue to focus as we were doing, and 2, we don't spend that on something else and create another bucket that's a new debt with that money that I just freed up. So you want to use momentum when we're trying to pay down debt. Well, one of the things with debt, that if you are in debt and you are paying something down, once you paid it off, let's just say you only had 1 card and you paid it off. Let's say for numbers sake, you were doing $250 a month to pay that down. When that ends, you should not stop the $250. The $250 should now go to you. And you should set that up to go funding into your savings account or spread it among the buckets like we just talked about. You're already spending the money. It's going to pay down debt, but once the debt is paid off, you've got to see yourself as the debt. And we'll talk about that when we get to budgeting, but keep that flow going. Don't say, oh, gee, I got it paid off. Now I can go, do something else with it or start putting it someplace. No, it should go to savings at that point.
The other thing too, before you move past the shotgun approach, is 2 things. First off, the math system, it works because it's most efficient. The momentum one works because of what we talked about. Money isn't math, it's about emotion. So it's really about having that perpetual, achievement, right? The third thing I would say is you're very right about now that you've got that paid down, keep making that payment towards yourself. But I also suggest a lot of times to clients, don't wait to start saving once again until that train comes in, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. No. It's an additional over and above. Absolutely. Thanks for pointing that out in terms of that, in case that wasn't clear. Yeah, you should already be saving in some aspect to buckets 1 and possibly 3 already.
Well, only because if you say you paid on that credit card, and then as soon as you got the credit card paid off, you got some kind of emergency thing come up, what happens? You're right back into the hamster wheel because you don't have the savings and you're going back to the credit card. You're starting all over again.
Right.
So it's really important, even if it takes you a little bit longer to pay off those cards, to start saving at the same time you're paying off those bills.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thanks for pointing that out, because that is important to make sure that we're following that along. So the next slide here is, this is a cartoon drawing of a family. And this is more for, and it's funny because it's the topic that Craig and I are doing this week, which is how to talk to your kids about money. But the lesson is that not only talking to your kids about money at an early age is very important, but as we transition and as parents now with older children, it's important to make sure that they are out on their own, that they are not dependent at that point, that you are making them aware and on their own, so that you're not creating this dependency on you, because that's money that's taking away from you as well. We all want to help our kids, but at some point, you do have to take the training wheels off and let them sort of ride on their own, so that you can be focused on what you're trying to accomplish, specifically when we're talking about later on in life and retirement.
So this picture is actually a picture of a family that's been colored with Crayola crayon magic crayons, right?
I don't know. Okay.
Well, looks like that, but your artwork is actually getting much better.
All right, so now we're talking about budgeting. So this is the big one here with budgeting, and that's Bob the Builder on the screen, because Craig is a fan of Bob the Builder. So that's can you build a better budget? Yes, you can. Right. So that's the idea. So budgeting on there is the 3 things are awareness, communication, and accountability. So the first part of it is you've got to be aware about what you're spending, how you're spending. Like we talked about, finding that balance, that mix between I'm spending and I'm saving. One of the things that we try to say to everybody is you can't save until you know what you spend, right? There's no way that I can try to be saving until I know what I'm saving. Till I know what I'm spending. So you have to be aware, and we'll talk about a second, going through and building that budget out. But also you want to communicate. If you've got a significant, like Craig just talked about, if there's a spouse or a significant other, or even somebody who's responsible for some of the other expenses in your home or residence, wherever you are, that's a communication. Even if it's one person who's better at dealing with the bills and money, there's emotion that gets involved there. So there does have to be that communication. And the last one is accountability, right? You've got to be accountable. You got to be able to look at yourself and say, this is why I'm spending, or this is what I have been spending, and I need to figure out why that is the case. We don't talk about this, and we'll talk about that at the end of this, about money and spending and what's going on with it. But so in order to be aware of that, you really need to figure out if you don't have a budget, or what type of a budget you are. And by that, we mean there's really 3 different types of people in budgeting. The first one is like Bob. He's an engineer, right? They've got spreadsheets. They know where everything is being spent. They've got it all together. And really what Craig and I might be able to do with them is maybe a little tweaking, a little helping, sort of being more efficient with the spending. Then there's person number 3, who really doesn't have a clue. Money comes in, money goes out. They know what they've got, somewhat of what they've got to spend money on, but they're really not tracking or worrying about where it's being spent or how it's being spent. They're not really the most dangerous. The most dangerous is person number 2, because you see, person number 2 thinks they're a 1, but they're really a 3. They think they have a budget. They think they know where the money's going, but in reality, they're spending beyond their means. And like Craig said, it's a negative savings when you come right down to the end of the month. So you just want to make sure you sort of got to handle, if you've never done a budget, this next part will help you in terms of thinking about that. But even if you have, it might help you take a little step back and think about, how am I spending my money, or how am I being with it? And so when we talk about building a budget, the first thing is it's an ongoing process. It's not going to be, hey, I'm going to take this long weekend that's coming up and I'm going to, put down all of my budget and I'm going to be done with it. It's an ongoing thing. You've got to realize that as you're doing a budget, this is something that needs to be talked about. It needs to be revisited. It's going to morph over time. So you want to make sure you're aware of that. You've got to know what your income is. You got to know what's coming in on a monthly basis, right? And so if you're getting a paycheck, it's fairly easy. I'm getting a paycheck, whether I'm getting paid every week or I'm getting paid twice a week. I can just, times it out, either times 52 and then divide by 12, and I'll get an average monthly income. Or if it's only 26 pay periods, well, okay, I do 26 times that number, divide by 12, and now I've got my average monthly income. We understand you might have, side hustles and part-time, you might get paid hourly, the hours might fluctuate. So you're going to have to base it based on maybe a couple of months combined to figure out what the average monthly income would be. But you got to know what that average monthly income is. Then we can break it down and start looking at what are we spending, or how are we spending. And the first thing we talk about are those must-pay expenses, right? Craig, you want to go into those must-pay expenses?
Sure. So the must-pay expenses are going to be those fixed expenses you have every month, such as mortgage or rent payment. If you're making a car payment, food, you have to buy food. At some point, some of that Tom will talk about later is discretionary. You're eating out versus eating in.
Right. So in the must-have, the food falls into that as the grocery, the stuff you're putting in the fridge, the stuff you're putting in the cabinets. That's must-have. That's not, it's not restaurant. That's not dining out. That's discretionary. We'll talk about that after.
Right. If you've got, medical insurance that you have to pay, those are the things that every single month, that bill is going to be there.
Right. And some of those are static. Some of those like even the rent, or, the mortgage is static, but even rent for a year, it won't go up until the next year. So for 12 months, what that number is going to be. Same thing usually with your utility bill, the phone bill, that type of thing. It's usually a static number. It might get raised again in the future in a year or two, but for a time being, you can look at it and say, this is what that number is going to be. But those are the expenses. That's what you plug in that you're going to pay first, right? So I've got what's coming in. Now I know what my fixed expenses are, what I've got to pay: the rent, the utilities, the insurance, food in the cabinets or the fridge. The next thing is you got to pay you. And see, this is where it trips most people up, is they don't think about paying themselves before anything else. And Craig always says, and that's a little notation that's in there that says, treat yourself like a bill, right? So you're paying the bills. You just got to treat yourself now like you're a bill. And by that, we mean money's got to get designated and go to those 3 buckets. Bucket number 1, emergency reserves. 2 and/or 3, if you're participating in the retirement plan at Perkins, then that's going into bucket number 3. And like we said, if you aren't, you should look at probably participating, even if it's just 1 or 2%, but fill bucket number 1 first, right? Do 1 or 2% there, and then focus the rest of your money going into bucket number 1. That will help you. Then once bucket number 1 is filled, now we can move over and start filling in with buckets 2 and 3, because I've got bucket number 1 completely set aside, whether you did 6 weeks or 8 weeks, whatever that number was for you, that was a comfort thing. But you've got to pay yourself. That's got to be the second part of your budget, because then that gets us to the third piece, which is discretionary expenses, like Craig talked about, which is dining out, eating lunch out, I don't know what people do nowadays. Like they were just talking about that with the Museum of Science is just reopening, I guess, right? Going to the movies and that type of thing. It's not available here in Massachusetts, certainly not going to sporting events. But I bet it.
Well, the other thing too, you see now, a lot of people may say having television, cable television is a necessity, but a lot of times you'll spend channels on, on Hulu and Netflix, and all those are discretion. right? Those are just add-on things that you want to have. That's discretionary expenses.
Correct. That's entertainment. Entertainment is a discretionary expense, and you might be spending it that way, like Craig just said, versus going out to someplace.
Another big one, another big discretionary. I want the name brand. I want the Gucci bag. I want the Ray-Ban sunglasses. Another discretion.
Correct. Well, those are all expenses that are being, again, that's all discretionary spending. That comes last. But you got to get through 1 and 2. If you're building out the budget and you're building it out in a way that's going to help you be more efficient at this, you want to build, I'm going to take care of the bills, then I'm going to take care of myself, then I'm going to have discretionary spending. If you look at last year with the quarantine, obviously a lot of that was down, though, as Craig said, with some of it between the Hulus and the Netflix and buying stuff off of Amazon, we probably ended up spending just about the same as what we've been doing over the years. But you want to track it, right? And that's the important thing. You want to make sure you know what's flowing out, where it's flowing, and what you're spending it on. This goes back to that whole give it to me now, wants versus needs, and what I'm trying to do. You want to make sure you know what you're spending on a regular basis for those.
Discretionary spending is the emotional trap, right? Because the issue is if you have a good handle on your budget, and now you're spending money, discretionary money, because you've got your budget under control, and you can, right? You can afford it. Well, then it's a good feeling. But if you're spending discretionary, not knowing what you have, or they're coming up short at the end of the day, or putting it on a credit card, well, then sometimes you don't feel so good about it, and it becomes this emotional trap. Well, it's so almost like a bad habit. I know I do it, but I got to have it. So,
yeah, it's something that that's why we say the cooling off period, because that's where that will take some of that out of the equation. Doesn't work all the time, but it can help sort of offset that, right? So then you want to compare, right? It's even after I put all this down, it's not like, hey, it's done. Like I said, now I got to go through and look, are these numbers right? Are they real, right? Am I being honest with myself with what I'm spending for this, or what I would put away on a regular basis? So you do have to do a little bit of compare and contrast and go through and make sure those numbers. And again, if there's another person involved, whether that's a spouse, significant other, roommate, whatever, you want to have them be involved in that conversation. Are these numbers real? Does this work? And then once you have that, then you can put the plan in place. And now once the plan is in place, now I can start to move forward and start really trying to live to this budget and make this all work for me. So the ideal budget, I'm going to go quickly through this because it is a visual in terms of theirs. And this isn't meant to be hard and fast for everyone, but it's just to give you some ideas and numbers and percentages. What it says is that 25% should be spent on housing. You should spend another 15% on transportation. There's 12% that's groceries and dining out. 10% goes to savings, 10% for your utilities and your phone, 5% to charity, 5% for entertainment, 5% on medical, holiday gifts, clothing, and miscellaneous is only 3%. Now, some of that gets a little skewy because obviously medical costs can be much higher than that, certainly if we're talking about the cost of paying for a premium. But what it really tries to say, and that's why I don't want to spend too much time in this, but it's like if I look at transportation, for example, and it says 15% of what you're spending, of your overall budget should be alluded to transportation costs. So what that's saying is that, if I'm earning in the, Corolla range, I shouldn't be trying to lease a Lexus, because then I'm going to be taken away from something else just because I want to drive that Lexus. And that's part of this, that whole mindset again, is to say, well, wait, I should be driving a Kia. Why am I trying to drive a Lexus type of thing? And you need to be thinking of it from that aspect. Sometimes we talk to people where, their expectations for where they want to live versus where they can live are not realistic, just based on the numbers and what they're trying to do. But that all factors into it when you go through this.
Now, Tom, because I'm driving when I go there, can I include Dunkin' Donuts in my transportation budget?
No. See, you include that in your discretionary spending because that's money that's flying out the door when you should have had coffee at home. All right, so think about your goals, right? So now that you know that, the money that's flowing in, where it's flowing out, you try to get a handle on that. You try to get, as Craig said, now it's looking at it and saying, gee, I'm spending how much for, do I really need to have Netflix, Hulu, Apple, and some other, service for my streaming? Maybe I can just deal with one of them on a monthly basis, right? These are little tweaks, little changes that if you can do that, then that money can flow to something else. And specifically, if we have some outstanding debt or we don't have emergency reserves built up, that's where it needs to go first. Then we can look about bringing back Hulu or Netflix or whichever one you prefer after that. All right, so I promised you that, because of where we are, the 11 ways to be better financial shape this year. So the first one is look at last year. And we say look at last year because 2020 with the upheaval, with the quarantine and everything. But if you look at what you spent in 2019 versus what you probably spent discretionary, we're talking about now, it was probably vastly different. You probably wound up with more money every week or in your savings than you had in 2019 just because you were limited of what you could not do. Unless, of course, you're like my daughter and, Amazon is a daily thing with us in terms of dropping packages at my house. But other than that, if you were able to, you probably found yourself, wait, I was able to do this. The question is, can you adjust your budget now to go forward here in 2021, even as we might be lifting and loosening some of the restrictions out there to be able to, whether it's build up that emergency reserves, pay down that debt, or save for some longer term event before you get back into the habit of doing all the things you were doing. So take a look at what you did last year versus, say, the year before. This said, treat your accounts like a good friend. And by that, it means check in every now and then. If you've got, look at your savings account, look at what you're spending in your debit card and what's being spent on that. Spend a little time going through that and taking a look at it and seeing, does this make sense for me? We already talked about checking your credit score. It's worth doing just to make sure it's up to snuff, that there's nothing funny on there, and that it's in the right place. We beat up the emergency reserve fund, but that's one we'll keep always coming back to because we just think it makes sense for everybody. And I already sort of hammered into if you're not participating in the retirement plan, you should, even if it's just getting in at 1 or 2%, because again, you're never going to get the time back. It's not so much that the money that goes in, it's the time difference and what that means to you when we're talking about compounding. Credit cards. All right, so credit cards have rewards, right? We hear all the stuff all the time. God bless Samuel L. Jackson tells me all the time about all the different rewards that there are in those credit cards. So if you're using one, let's find one that's got a reward that actually matches what's a good thing for you, right? So if it's cash back, use the cash back. Maybe be able to fund it towards something else. But just if you're going to use one that at least is giving you something. At this point, travel probably isn't a big thing for anybody. So why have a card that's going to give you travel reward if we're not traveling? 7 says participate in, that's supposed to be HSA. It's a typo that happened and pops up on the screen every now and then. It's supposed to be the health savings account versus the flex savings account. You can either or, but these are tax deferred ways to put money aside. One is for medical reasons, one is for other spending. Don't know if they're available with Perkins School or not, whether HSA or FSA, but you should look into it if it is available and take advantage. Yep.
Tom, we do have FSA. We don't have the health savings account.
Okay, so thank you, Laura, and that's great. So FSA is flex spending. That just means it's a use it or lose it. You got to use it within the year, but you can take advantage of that. And if you have expenses or know that there are expenses that you're spending for, it's worth doing and taking a look at. Again, that becomes a saving vehicle that you are then putting away to use for something that you're going to have to spend for. Comparisons, that's just, looking at those cash back and price comparisons, that's just a way to be better at savings. I don't know, Groupon or any of those things in terms of going through it. Number 9 there talks about journaling, and I'm a big proponent on tracking your spending. So understand, I told you in the beginning, I've been doing this for 21 years. 20 years ago, I used to talk to people about writing down everything they spent for a month. Yeah, well, nobody does that anymore. It's not, they didn't even do it then, so I realized quickly that that wasn't really happening. So it's not even 2 weeks. It's really try to say that, and I understand pencil and paper is a little tough for everybody because there feels like there's an app for everything out there. But really the mind, the brain thing about actually having to put pen to paper and write something down is another factor. It's another delay that says to me, do I really need to buy this thing? I'm going to spend how much on it? But if you can track what you spent for 1 week, and I mean every time you spent a dime, you track that, at the end of it, you're going to really see what you're doing with your money. Like Craig just talked about, the lattes, going to Dunks or going to Starbucks. I don't care what your religion is. Either one is fine. But, every time you did that and you wrote it down, how much you were actually spending, or that you went to the grocery store and you're only going to go there to buy 3 items and you walked out with 10 items. Well, how much extra did you spend in that situation? So tracking is very important because like I said, we need to know how much we're spending before we can really understand how to save. And the last one is talk about money, because honestly, nobody wants to talk about money. We'd rather talk about anything, including politics and all the mess that was going on there at the end of the year, than talk about money. But that I talked earlier about accountability. You really need to understand and have somebody that you can sound off and say, I'm a little concerned, or this isn't working for me, or I need help, or, a savings buddy or a spending buddy, somebody that you can call and, call it, what is that? What show is that? Make Me a Millionaire or something, phone a friend. Like, talk me off the ledge here. I'm going to buy this thing. I don't want to buy it. Talk me out of the store, that type of thing. So
Well,
talking about money is important.
I can tell you too, Tom, that, after doing this for 16 years and working with hundreds of couples, a lot of times they haven't had real serious conversations about money. I mean, they'll talk about, do we have enough to buy this, enough to buy that, but they don't really talk about retirement. They don't talk about savings. They don't talk about college planning, because it is even in a couple, a taboo subject, because it can be stressful. And so it's having, the problem is with money being an issue is not having, like you just said, open and honest communication about it. That's the most important thing.
All right, so I'm right about at the end of our time limit here. So that's really the end of this. So that's Craig and I, our contact information. That's us in our more formal setting, which is us with the jerseys on. If you've ever seen us around at any conference or anything, we're usually in our custom jerseys, because like I said, that's us in a much more formal setting. I do want to say one of the things we do offer for everybody, and to take advantage of certainly, is that we do offer the ability to sit down with us, have a conversation, and we'll even go through and put together a whole profile for you if you're concerned or unsure how to start or how to put the budget together. It's something that we offer for everybody. There's no cost, there's no obligation. I mentioned the nonprofit before, because we do everything through the nonprofit, so there is no obligation to that. It's just more of a trying to help everybody have a better relationship with their money. I will tell you, we will be sending you out an evaluation form, because we do this at a lot of organizations and for a lot of different community groups. We value the input and feedback we get from everybody. As a part of that, on it, there's a little thing that says, are you interested in meeting with us? Yes or no. And the promise we make to everybody, the promise we make to Perkins and to everybody who attends, if you check no, you're never going to hear from us. You're never going to get anything from us. It doesn't shut you off. You can always reach back out to us. We're just never going to reach out to you. But if you are interested, you do have questions, you do have concerns, you're not really sure about how to start or where to begin, if you check yes, we'll reach out, we'll set up a time to chat. We can do it via Zoom, and we can just try to answer your questions and sort of walk you through what might be a good place for you to start or to get you into a process. Craig, are there any questions for us?
I have no questions, but I did have, if everybody didn't check the chat, a comment from Laura talking about how to get themselves enrolled in the 403B retirement plan and to contact Robert Keegan at the Perkins.
Terrific. Yeah, that's great. And like I said, that's that's something that we recommend that no matter what age you are to do, because it's important, and it is let's call it a forced savings portion to that. You know, I'm dedicating this amount. Well, like I said, even if it's just 1 or 2%, it's going, and now that's a percentage that I know I'm saving, and you'll be surprised at 1 or 2% how much you really won't feel it because it's all pre-tax money. You're not really going to be feeling it all that much.
The other question I had is, will we be getting a copy of this recording or a copy of the PowerPoint?
So you'll be getting both, because actually I will be providing a copy of the video and the PowerPoint to Laura, and then Laura will be distributing from there. Is that okay, Laura? I mean, I can do it other way, but I figured it
No,
just.
that sounds great.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll be supplying, and the PowerPoint will be in a PDF form.
One other question I just got was, I was once told that if you have a credit card and you almost never use it, that affects your credit score. Is that true?
So the idea there is it can have an adverse effect because they want to see some activity. So you're talking about, let's just say, hey, I had $1,000. That's my maximum I'm allowed to use, and I'm not using it, right? So having a card for a long period of time is a good thing, but never using it, it doesn't ding you, but it doesn't really count toward your credit score in any way. You've sort of taken away the benefit of having this long-standing card. So that's why I always say that if you have a card, and maybe as Craig mentioned, you're doing Netflix or Hulu or something, put that on as that card, just so you remember that you're paying it every month, because that way that long-standing card now is being used, and it's just something you're paying on an automatic basis, but it shows activity.
The other thing, Tom, I tell people, a lot of times when we're getting people a lot, off the hamster wheel, it's about trying to have some good relationship with their credit. Once they have that good relationship, they built that safety, the security account that we told them, the emergency funds. As you mentioned, it's a good idea to have a card that gives you rewards. The nice part about that is if now what you want to do is you're paying that card off every month, it also gives you tracking. So you can go back to that statement and see everything you spent money on, and you're getting rewards. The issue, once again, is to make sure you're not having a revolving credit line. You're paying that off every month. Yep. Let's see. The other question I got: if you're starting retirement saving a bit later in the game, is the 403b the best place to start?
So the retirement plan is, for lack of a better way of describing it, the way I've always said it to people, is set it and forget it. Right? So this comes direct out of your paycheck, and it's pre-tax automatically. So you don't have to think about what I'm putting in or where I'm putting it, or that I have to file it, because it's done automatically. You can have it systematically go to fund an IRA out of your bank account, but that's after-tax money going to pre-tax money that you then have to file and make sure that you've got it on track for. The 403b through the company lets you put more away than an IRA does. If you were doing less than $7,000, if you're over 50, talked about getting started later in the game, then you don't have to worry about it. You can go IRA. But the company plan is much more efficient from that standpoint of, like I said, it's a set it and forget it. I don't have to think about it. Once I fill that form out, I know every paycheck it's going to get fulfilled.
And what's the maximum contribution for a 403b now, Tom? Is that like 17.5 still plus a catch-up?
19,500 if you are under the age of 50. If you are turning 50 in 2021 or over 50, then you get to use, and you'll forgive me for this, the Heinz 57 rule, which is the catch-up provision. That's my whole thing with that. Little joke. I'm trying to have a little fun here. It's a snowy day, but it's a catch-up provision that allows you to put an additional 6,000 in. So actually 6,500. The total max for 2021 is $26,000 this year.
25.5. Right. Yes. Okay. Great.
Any other questions?
I have no other questions on the board. This is your
I
last.
just want to make a quick comment. Perkins does allow a $500 rollover on our FSA. So if folks are interested in signing up for that, we do. Not all companies do it. We do allow that. So for people that are interested, our open enrollment is going to be this spring. So keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, so just to follow through with what Laura's talking about, there was normally the money that goes into the FSA is use it or lose it, got to use it in the calendar year. or that's it, you don't benefit from it. However, whereas as she just said, with that $500, that's tremendous, because that means if I don't spend it all, I can roll it over to the next year. And the whole idea is thinking of this as for when that savings does get needed. Something happens, now I need to dip into it. If I'm contributing, plus I had the rollover occur, now I've got a bucket I can dip into. That's what we're talking about with having that bucket. That's a great benefit, Laura. That's tremendous.
And I'm glad you brought that back up, because the other thing too is a lot of times people like Tom and I, we're financial advisors. Our wives are teachers. I'm on my wife's plan. So a lot of times you may be on a spouse or a domestic partner's plan, and they may have an HSA available to them or some other feature like that. So it's just worth having that conversation.
Exactly. And I just want to plug our retirement plan. So I mentioned the 403B, that's where employees contribute. You can contribute out of your own paycheck for that, either percentage value or a dollar amount. You can change that at any time. And you can contact Robert Keegan in benefits. The other retirement plan we have is called a 401A retirement plan. And that is where Perkins contributes on your behalf. So regardless of any retirement contributions, Perkins is going to contribute a fixed percentage into your retirement account with Fidelity. So any questions on those plans, you can contact Robert Keegan in benefits and he can walk you through it.
Yeah, so that's tremendous. So basically you've got a money purchase pension arrangement. Essentially, it's a contribution plan. It's not a true pension, but Perkins is making an amount of money available every year based on criteria. Yeah,
Yep.
that's great. It's a wonderful benefit that, a lot of nonprofits, we see it occasionally, but that's a tremendous benefit that they're able to extend. So you're then, by contributing on your own, you're building up the savings even faster, is what happens there. So that's even more of a benefit as far as going through that. So definitely something you should look into. Like I said, if it's a goal to try to be better at saving this year, that's a way to do it. And that's the answer to that question about whether or not it makes sense to go into the plan, because the plan is there. You don't have to think about it. Once you're in, right? The whole set it and forget it thing. And then there's no thinking about it like, oh, I have to make the contribution. I can't tell you how many people that we deal with, a lot of small business owners that, last year they extended the tax filing date to the middle of July. My conversations were taking place in early July about how much can I contribute to my 2019 taxes type of thing. So you got to have the money in order to make that contribution, which we've talked about gets tough. So that's why if you do it through the payroll, it's much more efficient. And that's everything we got. So if there are no other questions, everything, listen, I want to say, appreciate having you all on today. I do have a disclosure, that's nothing more than, we didn't make any of this stuff up. We only can use the parameters of the world that we live in, the sandbox that we're playing in right now, as far as any of the stuff with taxes and all of that other stuff. So just so you know.
Well, thank you so much, Tom and Craig. It's really been a pleasure chatting with you today, and your presentation was fantastic. Well, as you mentioned, I'll be sending out the link to the recording and the PowerPoint. So really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. And like I said, for everybody who's on, we are going to get the evaluation form. So just do us the favor, just send it back to us. Again, it's really quick and it's online. So it's a link and it's fillable right from the link. So you don't have to print anything or check anything. It's literally just a couple of keystrokes and fill it out and send it back, because we do appreciate your time and your feedback and input on this.
It keeps us from talking about things you don't want to hear about.
Yeah. Right.
Thanks so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Where's my